The Americans with Disabilities Act celebrated its 30th anniversary on July the 26th, 2020. It was my privilege to play a role in the legislative process. You've heard that passing a law can be compared to making sausage, not a pretty process, but one with a positive outcome. That was certainly true in this case. The ADA was a collaborative effort of Democrats, Republicans, the legislative and executive branches, federal and state agencies, and people with and without disabilities. Modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it resulted from decades of work by thousands of people in the disability community. Its passage was a major milestone in our nation's history. The law prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and communications. The inclusion of people with disabilities has always been important to me. My aunt, Florence Reed, contracted polio as a 10-year-old, long before there was a vaccine. As a result, she was paralyzed on her right side from the waist down. Florence provided a shining example to our family as she lived successfully and gracefully with a disability at a time when there was little to no public access and limited opportunities for employment. My grandfather saw to it that she attended a rehabilitation hospital in St. Louis, that she received secretarial training, drove one of the first cars in the country equipped with hand controls, and was an involved citizen of our small West Texas town where she had a career that spanned 42 years. To say she was independent is an understatement. In 1985, I was working as an accessibility specialist for the Disability Resource Center of Tucson. Direct was one of a growing number of independent living centers throughout the country dedicated to assisting people with disabilities to live with dignity and independence. This 1987 photo is of our staff, with me on the back row, at our newly opened, fully accessible facility. In January 1986, the National Council on the Handicapped issued a report, Toward Independence, which called for a comprehensive equal opportunity law. It included the first draft of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1985. That spring, Direct sent me to Washington, D.C. to a conference that was sponsored by the National Council on Independent Living. The draft was shared with our small group of about 50 attendees to obtain our feedback. In preparation for the legislative process ahead, two civil rights icons, Jesse Jackson and Eleanor Schmiel, then president of the National Organization of Women, spoke to us about their experiences in shepherding civil rights legislation through Congress. I brought along my college-aged daughter, and it was an experience neither of us will forget. 2 years later, in 1988, the National Council on the Handicapped released a second report on the threshold of independence, which included a revised version of the bill, which was introduced into the 101st Congress. The bill passed both houses by wide margins, going next to a conference committee to reconcile differences. In 1988, Senator John McCain, one of the original 5 co-sponsors of the ADA, created an Executive Advisory Committee on Disability Issues. I was honored when Senator McCain invited me to become a member. A group of approximately 20 advocates from Arizona began regular meetings with him. This slide depicts Senator McCain along with Senator Bob Dole and Marka Bristow, the Executive Director of the National Council on Independent Living, all major leaders in promoting the bill's passage. Rallies and demonstrations supporting the legislation sprung up all over the country as the bill made its way through Congress and the rulemaking process. In addition to working with Senator McCain and his staff, I met often with other members of the Arizona delegation to garner support statewide, making a number of trips to D.C., visits to the Hill, and to local congressional offices. On the day in 1990 when the House took its final vote, I sat mostly alone in the gallery. A large crowd of people with disabilities and advocates had gathered, and ironically could not sit in the chambers due to a lack of accessibility for wheelchairs. They watched the debate on closed-circuit TV from an adjoining room. I chose not to join them because I wanted to directly witness the House in action. It still gives me chills to think about that day. I was thrilled to receive an invitation from President George H.W. Bush to attend the signing ceremony to be held on July the 26th, 1990. Prior to the ceremony, Senator McCain held a news conference in his office, which was broadcast live by the NBC affiliate in Tucson. To our surprise, those of us attending were driven by limo in a motorcade down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House and given preferential treatment through security courtesy of the President's Committee on Employment. The disability community declared that July the 26th, 1990, was a new Independence Day. 2,000 people, most of whom had disabilities, gathered on the south lawn of the White House to witness this historic event. As part of the ceremony, Justin Dart, chair of the President's Committee on Employment and the father of the ADA, called on those who love the American dream to turn the promise of the ADA into the reality of democracy. He said, "We must create the attitudes and environment which will enable all people with disabilities to be fully equal and fully productive, not only in law, but in everyday life." In the President's remarks, George Bush said, "With the signing of this landmark legislation, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, and freedom." When President Bush handed Harold Wilkie a ceremonial pen, Wilkie, who had no hands, accepted the gift by holding it between his toes and placing it in his shoe. A special moment indeed. The crowd let out a long cheer when the signing was completed, then headed across the street to Lafayette Park for a celebratory picnic lunch. As we returned to the House office building, my colleague and I met a vendor with a cardboard cutout of President and Mrs. Bush. I paid the vendor $10 to take this photo. The framed display shows my ticket to enter the ceremony, an American flag, a ceremonial button, a fuzzy picture taken from where we were standing, and a White House napkin from the picnic. Attending the signing of the ADA was one of the most exciting and fulfilling days of my life, made even more special by being surrounded by so many people who would directly benefit from the protections provided by the law. I later visited my Aunt Florence to tell her about the whole experience and what the ADA means for others with disabilities, and to thank her for teaching me by her example. She did not seem to be that impressed, but I was never sure she understood the real significance of the law. Even so, I am eternally grateful I was part of this historic sausage-making experience.